What inspires a writer who lives up the street from a circus academy with his husband and family of raccoons? Let's find out. Hi, my name is Crystal Fletcher, and welcome to All About Books. If you love books, then you've come to the right channel because you get to meet the person behind the novel as well as find out what inspires them to write it. To stay up to date with the latest author interviews, please subscribe to my channel in the right-hand corner of your computer. And today, I am delighted to have author David Kingston Yeh with me. David is a counselor and an educator. He has written 4 plays, and his short fiction has appeared in numerous magazines. We'll be discussing his latest novel right here, Tales from the Bottom of My Soul, which was published by Guernica Editions. And a big congratulations to you, David, right now, because your novel is ranked #1 in LGBTQ stories from around the world on Goodreads.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Great, 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 great. And just to give everyone a little taste what the novel is about, I'll read from the back jacket. Welcome to the second installment in the adventures of Daniel Garneau, his eccentric family and friends. When a long-lost sister shows up as a trans man named Luke, a series of precipitous events throws the lives of boyfriends, Daniel and David, into turmoil. In this rollicking sequel to A Boy at the Edge of the World, the couple's exploration of sex, intimacy, and love comes to a head when a shocking revelation tests their commitment and future together. David, welcome to All About Books.
Thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. So I have to admit, I am very intrigued. You live up the street from the Circus Academy.
I do. Yeah. So I'm based in downtown Toronto, and some years ago, my partner and I, we purchased our first home, this home, and we just ended up down the street from this circus school. It's in downtown Toronto's East End, a neighborhood called Leslieville. I call it a circus school, but it's called Center of Gravity. It's a circus production company, and it hosts many events, and it's really quite wonderful and just kind of fantastical to be able to share that tidbit of detail. I think it's something very special and about what this city has to offer. Maybe I can say 20 years ago, when I first came to Toronto, I moved here as a student to attend theater school myself. So right from the get-go, I'd heard of Center of Gravity, and I'd always been connected with carnival and outdoor theater, movement-based, dance-based theater. So it's interesting how I've come full circle, and now I'm living down the street from Center of Gravity, which has been around for over 25 years.
That's incredible. I had never heard of it. So thank you for bringing that into on my radar as well.
I might add actually that I'm thinking in my first book, which is a predecessor to Tales from the Bottom of My Soul, I actually set a scene at one of the events hosted by Center of Gravity called Lunacy Cabaret. It's an awful lot of fun. It sounds like its title. So it's very close and dear to my heart. Many of the locations that I refer to in the book, many, I would say practically all of them, have to do with my own lived experiences here in Toronto.
And I got that real sense when I was reading your book, David, like this connection to the city and all its places, but not just your cityscapes, but also your rural landscapes as well. You know, Daniel goes camping with his brothers.
Yeah.
Is this you coming out in your character, do you think, or is this strictly your character?
Um, that's a really interesting question. I had never thought much about it. It is very much part of my own experience.
Mm-hmm.
I might say, and I'm again alluding to the first book, because Tales from the Bottom of My Soul is continuation of a book that I
Yes.
published 2 years ago called A Boy at the Edge of the World. So Daniel's story begins there. Daniel Garneau is
Yes.
our protagonist. And so the whole of the book takes place in the city, but in the final chapter, my characters, they go on a road trip up north.
Mhm.
I don't think you read the first book, so it's really interesting you make this point, and it was important for me to end that first book reconnecting with nature. These kids, these three
Yes.
brothers and their friends, they're driving up north, drinking Tim Hortons coffee, eating poutine, listening to the Bare Naked Ladies, and they head up to their family cottage up in northern Ontario near Sudbury.
Yes.
And for me, that was a good closure to that chapter. So you're highlighting something for me that I think we might consider as the tip of an iceberg of something bigger, and that has to do with dichotomies and how maybe I might say essentially reflects something about our Canadian experience, how we might have 2 feet in 2 different worlds or multiple worlds, whether it's geographically urban centers or
Mhm.
rural centers, city, country. Nevertheless, while 80% of our Canadian population, we live, you and I, in big urban centers, we have this backyard,
Yes.
this extraordinary landscape. It's been mythologized, right, by Farley Mowat and
Mhm.
David Suzuki. Um, and I think it's something that not only transcends our geography, but also we can speak about the topography or the geography of our cultural landscape, right? There's a tradition that we're connected to that we can think of as old world, European, and then we oscillate between that and this North American, very modern sensibility. Um, Also, there's this colonial white tradition and a very real uh, reality that has to do with our diverse immigrant
Mhm.
experiences too. And we do oscillate between that. And there's a tension, of course, between those two traditions. And then, of course, in the book, Tales from the Bottom of My Soul, I continue this story exploring themes of sex and sexuality and
Mhm.
gender and identity. So, to state the obvious, there's a tradition of heteronormativity and cis-normativity, and how in Canada, I think in the 21st century, and the characters, they are millennials, we are really exploring in a new way, or perhaps we can think of it as a renaissance in sexual and gender politics. So on so many levels, I think you're touching on this idea that there's a dichotomy and a synergy between old and new, young and old,
Mhm.
past and future. And in this book, I do speak about multiple generations and how we experience across generations and frankly across cultures
Mhm.
issues of sexuality and gender. So millennials certainly don't have a monopoly on misadventures in sex and love.
And I'm sorry, I jumped ahead with that question. I really should also kind of take a step back and ask you, David, what inspired you to write the misadventures of Daniel Garneau? You know, you're
Ah,
a gay hockey player from small town Ontario.
sure. That's a big question. Um, I have two answers, and they're
Okay.
clear to me. One, of course, I'm inspired by, and I've alluded to this, my own lived experience as a young gay man
Mhm.
moving to Toronto. And I do want to say that my partner, his name is Daniel, and and like the Daniel in the book, the fictional Daniel Garneau, and I stress fictional, my real life Daniel, he's also French Canadian. He also has 2 brothers, and his family, of course, is from Sudbury, and of course, my Daniel comes to Toronto as a student like myself to
Mhm.
study. A young boy coming to the big city and all of the discovery, the confusion, the deliciousness, and the anxiety and wonder that brings. So I certainly draw from my own lived experience. And I might add, many of the characters in this story are named after friends, people we know in our own lives.
Yeah.
So that's certainly an inspiration. A second inspiration is it's more complex. As you know, as you mentioned, I work professionally as a counselor with
Yes.
LGBTQ youth, and I've been doing that for many years. So for many years, I've heard stories, hundreds, thousands of stories told by young queer and trans people about their lives, their struggles, their hopes, their desires, um, their resilience, their joy, and everything that happens in the novel, in the course of Daniel's story, everything that I recount, all of the events, the themes, really are a distillation of all of these stories, these thousands of stories that I've heard over the last 15 years that I've worked as a counselor. So my first book is actually dedicated to all the Daniels of the world, right? So it's really my heart dedicated to the young people who have really informed me, humbled me, and inspired me.
Oh, that's incredible. That's incredible. I was also really intrigued, David, that Daniel is a triplet.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So, what led to the creation of your protagonist being a triplet?
Okay. As I mentioned, my Daniel in real life, my partner,
Yeah.
he's one of three brothers.
Yes.
I'm actually one of three brothers myself. And if that's a coincidence, then that's serendipitous.
Yes.
So this history, this lived experience of brotherhood is very, very much part of my life. Now, I met my partner 21 years ago, and right away they welcomed me. And I actually lived,
Yeah.
one of his brothers was one of my housemates. I lived with him for some time. So I've gotten to know his family, his brothers, very, very closely. So, so the idea that Daniel Garneau in the book would be one of three brothers, that was even something I thought about. That just came up naturally. Now you're
Yeah.
asking what made me decide for them to be triplets. When I was writing the first chapter of the first book some years ago, it just came out actually. I have no
Yeah.
explanation. It's one of those inexplicable things that
Yeah.
authors do. And I actually recall wanting to go back or thinking I would go back and correct it and just kind of flesh it
Oh,
out. Okay, so maybe I think I
yeah.
was taking a shortcut at the time. And then it just stayed. And of course, obviously, later on in the months and years to come, I did a bit of more research about triplets. And it was valuable to me to be able to take these three boys who were the exact same age and highlight how different they were as human beings. I think any twin or triplet will let you know they're not.
Yes.
They're not identical by any means.
I really love that because I thought it added such an interesting dimension to your novel. Okay. Now, I also really loved that each chapter of your novel begins with a song. You know, everything from Robbie Robertson's Somewhere Down This Crazy River to Tom Cochrane's Boy Inside the Man. So, what was your song selection process? Would be the first question.
Um, yeah, I love this question. Um, First of all, it's not just any song, but these are all Canadian songs,
Yes.
right? And again, alluding to both books, A Boy at the Edge of the World and this novel, Tales from the Bottom of My Soul. Between the two of them, there are 32 chapters. To answer your question directly, I wrote the manuscripts first, and I did write
Okay.
books back to back, right? This is, goodness, 170,000 words back to back over 3-4 years. And then I went back and polished each chapter.
Yes.
And if I can just pause and digress, I have described these books as episodic novels. They're very
Mhm.
much memoir styled. They're told in the first person. It's a fictional or faux memoir. And I've even had readers of Tales from the Bottom of My Soul share how they felt that they were reading a series of short stories that were interconnected. I don't know if
Mhm.
that might have been your experience or not. And frankly, I have no issue with that. It's a fair reflection. I share that because it really highlights how each chapter has its own identity, at least in my mind and heart.
Mhm.
So when I was going back and redrafting these chapters and polishing them, and these are all rooms in a house, if you will. Um, And then afterwards, after I really was able to distill what this chapter was about, its themes, its events, its issues, then I went looking for a song title.
Yeah.
Now, I have to confess, it wasn't the musicality of the song that I was interested in per se, but I was interested in the title as a line of poetry, a line of
Yeah.
Canadian poetry.
Yeah.
And I was looking for these titles a title that would really reflect and highlight the content of the chapter itself.
Yeah.
I do want to share a story. I've actually never ever spoken about this, but when I drafted my first manuscript, it was full of references to Canadian songs and lyrics. One of my characters, Daniel's brother, Pat, he's a musician. So he's constantly
Yes.
speaking about and reciting and quoting musicians. And then obviously, as a writer, you would know this. Very quickly, I discovered, David, you can't do that. Right? There are copyright issues here. So I was quite heartbroken when I was told that. So I need to go back and take all of this music out of the text. So it was with some joy that I discovered song titles are not copyrighted. So it was a free for all. I just went grabbing for these song titles. So I had compiled a list of song titles of Canadian songs that I would refer to, and I would just pick one or two and weigh them and decide this is the one. It's a cherry on top of that chapter. These are cherries on top of the cake of the book.
And I'd have to say, David, as a reader, it was so fun to see the song title at the beginning of the chapter because I started the chapter with the song in my head.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I really, really appreciated that. I thought that was absolutely fantastic, and it just made the reader experience, it just gave it a whole new dimension for me. So, yeah, I loved it.
You're I'm inspired to go back and listen to those songs again, actually myself.
Yeah, well, and that's why now that you've explained it, but I had wondered, did he write with the music playing in the background? Because it was so perfectly fit, all of your song titles. So it was great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now,
I like to say that that also speaks to your own imagination and power as a reader, as readers. And I'm imagining we're all voracious readers, right? We bring so much of our own subjectivity, right? I do tend to write in a fairly documentary or literary realist style. So I tend not to go into inner monologue. So for you to be able to bring that extra quality to the chapter, I'm just so grateful for. Thank you.
well, and I'm grateful that you brought it out. So thank you. Um, so, David, I'd asked for you to read a segment from your novel. And before you begin, can you just let us know why you've decided to choose this particular section?
Sure, of course. It's a passage from chapter 2, and it's that burlesque scene.
Ooh.
So it's actually part of a conversation. So it's not terribly dramatic. It's not a cathartic moment per se or turning point in the narrative. But I did choose it after some reflection because I felt it just reflected the tone or the quality or the character of the book in its entirety.
Mhm.
Um, and we can chat about that afterwards. You don't know what I'm about to read per se, but also let me set up the context a little bit. So Daniel and David, these two boyfriends, they're about 25 years old. On Valentine's Day, they decide to go to a burlesque show in downtown Toronto. And these two young men, they're wearing kilts, right? They're not Scottish, but people who attend these burlesque shows, people dress up, and it's an awful lot of fun. And I've attended many of these burlesque shows myself. So they show up, and it's a wonderful show. And afterwards, they're hanging out, they're having a drink at the bar afterwards, and they bump into old acquaintances. It's another couple now. Their names are Frederick and Rebecca, and it's an older couple. They're in their 60s, and they're elegant and they're sophisticated, and they're in a tuxedo and an evening gown, and they're drinking champagne. And so these two young men and this older couple, they're having a conversation, right? And they're talking about life and relationships. and inevitably the conversation turns to the burlesque show itself. So, so we're parachuting in in the middle of this really discursive conversation. This was our first burlesque, David said. We really enjoyed it. Becky tilted her glass flute towards him. And what part did you enjoy the most? David opened and closed his mouth. I mentally prayed as hard as I could he wouldn't mention Lobster Girl drizzling her tits with melted butter. Another second passed, and I was just about to intervene when David replied, the characters, the storytelling, the parody. Take that act with the opera diva and the maestro. It was clearly a commentary on the intersections of racism and patriarchy. I stared at my pot-smoking bike mechanic boyfriend, but he wasn't done yet. Look, does a woman's body have value only before a man's gaze? Or can she step outside the script that's been assigned her? Can she have her own voice? I mean, when she hit that high note and blew that guy's pants off, literally, that was freaking brilliant. Society codifies and commodifies sexuality and beauty. But tonight was a celebration of the human form in all of its shapes, colors, and sizes. Rebecca's gaze narrowed. Some would say it's still exploitation. It's still women being paid to remove their clothes. But for whom? Look, how many straight men do you think were in the audience tonight? Very few, I'd say. If these dancers are doing burlesque to feel joyful and subversive and defiant, and if it's in front of an appreciative and supportive audience, then that's real empowerment. The truth of it is, burlesque isn't inherently feminist or anti-feminist any more than any other art form. But like any art form, it can be used for good or for evil. For good or for evil, Becky said. How terribly romantic. David emptied his pint in one slow, unhurried quaff. As I watched his Adam's apple bob up and down, framed by the rough, unshaven curve of his jaw and the musculature of his throat and neck, I realized, with the inexorable and elemental force of a glacier calving, that after 2 years, I was just beginning to know this man standing next to me with no underwear on and his balls hanging out, that I just scratched the surface of everything he was and everything he was capable of. Reaching between Frederick and Becky, David set his empty pint glass on the bar, shrugged, and knuckled away the moistness on his upper lip. I'm Italian, he said.
Thank you. I really loved that, how, even after 2 years in a relationship, how people can surprise you. And yeah, you really are thinking about them.
Yeah, that's important.
Yeah, I thought that was fantastic. Just a couple more questions for you, David. So you alluded to it a little bit at the beginning, but why was it so important for you to create a gay coming-of-age story that captured adventure, levity, and the wonder of adulthood?
Yeah. I wrote that statement just a few years ago when I was, pardon me, a few weeks ago. Thank you. When I was just updating my website. So if you read that on my website, I think, then
yes.
I'm imagining you would have read my response, which is very simple, and also so complex. But my simple answer is, there's enough gay-themed storytelling that's grim, that's sardonic, that's tragic. There's enough gay-themed storytelling that's rooted in trauma. Now, these stories, they are so important it's so important that they're written. It's so important that they're heard. I work as a trauma therapist, actually, so
Yeah.
it's my profession, 5 days a week, listening to these kinds of stories of struggle, obviously, by LGBTQ young people, especially in the face of transphobia and homophobia,
Mhm.
sexism, transmisogyny. At the same time, it's not our only story. I speak as a gay man, right? It's not our only story. I didn't want to write another Brokeback Mountain. As powerful and as important as stories like that are or might be, um, nor did I want to write another cinematic Love Simon either. I wanted to write something that was at first initially ethnographically accurate. That sounds very academic, but also really from the bottom of my heart. These are tales from the bottom of my soul. And soul
Yes.
means the bottom of my feet, where I've traveled as a gay man and where I've witnessed young people traveling, young millennials traveling in the last decade, 15, 20 years. So much has changed. Toronto, Ontario has been one of the epicenters of gay rights, gender rights, uh, queer rights. Um, it's it's a privilege to have been able to hear these kinds of stories, and this is my gift, if you will, back to the community. Speaking on
Yes.
behalf, very much of myself. So it is about a gay man, but I hope I'm able to showcase a diversity of characters in the book that might represent, in a truthful and really, I feel, heartfelt way, my own experience of what the queer community has been, is, and can be in Toronto, and hopefully the rest of the world.
No wonder you're number one on Goodreads right now. I mean, what an absolute gift. Like to make a difference like that for so many people. So that's wonderful.
Thank you.
Now, it's my understanding that you're currently working on a third installment. Is correct?
Yes, a third final installment.
Oh, it is the final. May I ask what it's about or?
Of course, thank you. Thank you for asking.
Okay.
I'm deep, deep into it. It's a third book.
Yeah.
As it turns out, right, Daniel's story has become a trilogy. When I first
Yeah.
started, this wasn't my intention. But very, very early on, I realized I didn't have the room to explore all of its themes as deeply and as thoroughly as I wanted to. So it's ended up being 3 books. So right now, literally, I'm about halfway through this third book. Um, the first book very much was about sex and dating.
Mhm.
This second book, Tales from the Bottom of My Soul, in my mind and heart, is much more about relationships, and it begins to speak more deeply about family intergenerationally,
Yeah.
as well as our own families, including chosen families. The third book, without giving too much away, is much more specific. It's about parenthood and childhood too. We actually, even over the course of 2 books, we don't learn much about Daniel's childhood. We don't know much about his parents. But in the third book, we do go back and we
Mm.
explore Daniel's family history. And so there are a number of flashbacks that I'm writing now about his childhood, these 3 boys growing up in Sudbury. And these moments when he begins to discover that he's not quite like the other boys, even as he's playing hockey and roughhousing at school, and that you know, kids, young people's events, and so forth.
Aw.
So there's my teaser.
Yes, well, we'll look forward to that one coming out in the world then too. And
Hopefully, thank you.
yes, I'm sure it will. And a great, great big thank you today for coming on All About Books and talking about your gift of a novel. And it was a pleasure, pleasure, pleasure chatting with you. What I'll do is I'll put links down below in the description box. So if anyone wants to learn more about David or purchase a copy of a novel, you can do so. And thank you so much, everyone, for listening. And please do come back next week because I'll have another author and we'll learn about what inspires them. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal.
Pleasure.